computers.
John Veraeke. Dr. Vervaeke has been teaching at the University of Toronto since 1994. He currently teaches courses in the Cognitive Science program, including Introductory Cognitive Science and the Cognitive Science of Consciousness. Dr. Vervaeke also teaches courses in the Psychology department on insight problem solving and the Psychology of Wisdom, and courses in the Buddhism, Psychology, and Mental Health program on Buddhism and Cognitive Science, mindfulness meditation, and the cultivation of consciousness through instruction in Vipassana meditation. Dr. Vervaeke has won and been nominated for several impressive teaching awards, including the 2001 Students Administrative Council and Association of Part-Time Undergraduate Student Teaching Awards for the Humanities, and the 2012 Ranjini Ghosh Excellence in Teaching Award. Dr. Vervaeke's most recent publications include Relevance Realization, the Emerging Framework in Cognitive Science, that appeared this year, 2012, written with Tim Lillicrap and Blake Richards, a forthcoming chapter in Personal Wisdom entitled Relevance, Meaning, and the Cognitive Science of Wisdom, with Leo Ferraro, and a forthcoming chapter with Leo entitled Relevance Realization and the Neurodynamics and Neuroconnectivity of General Intelligence. Dr. Vervaeke's research interests are relevance realization, insight problem solving, general intelligence, consciousness, mindfulness, rationality, and wisdom. And today he's here to present his talk, The Bioeconomics of Relevance Realization and General Intelligence.
It's a great pleasure to be here, as always. I'm always thrilled to participate in anything that CASA is involved with. As many of you know, the Cognitive Science program here is pretty much my baby in a lot of ways, and I really care about it, and it's thrilling to see the success of this conference already. Before I begin, I want to just mention that my talk is based on the two papers that Jim just mentioned. The first is the one with Tim and Blake that was published in the Journal of Logic and Computation, and the second one is one that's forthcoming with Leo Ferraro. However, I do want to mention that that second paper is deeply indebted to an unpublished manuscript that Leo and I worked on with Zach Irving. All right, so this is what I want to do with you. Oops. So I want to run through these 5 arguments with you. The first of the centrality of the problem of relevance. Then the second is some of the necessary features of an account of relevance. Third, I want to argue that it's not relevance, but rather relevance realization that we can have a theory of. Fourth, I want to talk about the bioeconomics of relevance realization, and I hope that provides maybe a ground for the rest of the conference about the continuity between cognitive science and economics. And 5, I want to pursue an argument linking relevance realization to general intelligence. All right, so this is a bit of a snapshot from the 2012 paper, but the idea here is that understanding relevance is the key to understanding a lot of dilemmas in psychology and cognitive science. I'm going to talk about 3, the first rather more in depth, and then the other 2 in a more gestural manner. Problem solving, categorization, and communication. All right, so this is what we're going to take a look at when we quickly talk about problem solving, search space models, and combinatorial explosion, the fact that most real-world problems are ill-defined, and the need for insight. So this is a classic way of trying to formalize problem solving pioneered by Newell and Simon. And the idea here is you basically formalize problem solving in terms of some specification of a goal state represented by the red dot. And then you have some initial state. So for example, I'm hungry, that's my initial state, and my goal state is I don't want to be hungry anymore. You then have operators that can transform your state into another state. These are things you can do that will change your state. And the idea is I can apply them again and again, different operators to different states, and so on, until I get a sequence of transformations that transforms the initial state into the goal state. Along the way, there are path constraints on how I'm allowed to do this. For example, one of the ways I could make lunch in order to satisfy my hunger is to burn down my house, and that would cook all the food inside of it. My wife objects to this, so this is a significant path constraint on me satisfying my hunger. Now, all that in and of itself looks kind of like, yeah, so what? Yeah, that's obvious, right? But the thing here is, one of the things that Newell and Simon pointed out is you have to be very careful here, right? The problem with this kind of diagram is we have a God's eye view, right? And we can just sort of see the solution. But the problem in life is you're here, and you're looking this way, and you don't know which of all these possible alternative pathways is going to get you to your goal state. And that's the problem. The number of pathways that confront you is vast. So here's a standard way of calculating it. That's the size of the search space, where F is the number of operators and D is the number of steps. So average chess game, 30 legal moves on any given turn, and an average of 60 turns. And so that's your search space. That's the number of alternatives you're confronting. So this is known as combinatorial explosion, because that's a big number. Here's some comparisons. That's 10 to the 10 is the number of neurons in the human brain. That's 5 times 10 to the 14 is the approximate number of synaptic connections. So we do have big, very complex brains, but that's not enough, because that number is dwarfed by the combinatorial explosive number of the search space. In fact, that number is larger than the approximate number of atoms in the universe. Okay, so that's a big number. So how do we do this? This became one of the central, this is one of the great insights of the Newell and Simon formalization. They were able to actually pose a really good question, which is, how do we do this? So one of the most important distinctions they made, a distinction they actually sort of took from Polya, was the distinction between heuristics and algorithms. Okay, so an algorithm is guaranteed to get you a solution. And generally that means, in order to, if you're starting with a lot of unknown information, right, that means you have to search the entire search space in order to guarantee that you find a solution. And so algorithmic processing often launches you into combinatorial explosion. So Newell and Simon proposed as an alternative the use of heuristics that do not search the whole search space, but try to increase the probability of you finding a problem solution. However, I'm going to argue as we go along that heuristic processing alone is insufficient, and that's going to be because there's no final definition of relevance. Part of what heuristics do is they try to predefine what information is going to be considered relevant or important, and that's always going to be problematic, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. What I want to zero in now is that problem formulation is essential to how we solve problems. Okay. So why is problem formulation central? Well, one of the issues is that problem formulation, as we're going to see, is how we're going to constrain the search space. How we formulate a problem is going to shape what we're going to consider in the search space. Therefore, problem formulation significantly affects how searchable that space actually is. So in and of itself, problem formulation is crucial for dealing with combinatorial explosion. But there's a second reason why problem formulation is so important, and that has to do with the fact that most real-world problems are ill-defined. So in well-defined problems, we have some clear representation of the goal state, the initial state, and the set of operators I can perform. So, for many of you, I think a classic multiplication problem would be a well-defined problem. You know what the initial state is, you know what numbers are, you know what the operators are, you know what the goal state is, that the end result of the multiplication should be another number. It shouldn't be the drawing of a platypus or something like that. So you know what to do there. Now the problem is that many real-world problems are ill-defined because the goal state is murky. We're not clear what it is. We're unclear about the initial state. And it's unspecified what the set of operators are. So for example, I'm facing an ill-defined problem right now. I'm trying to give a good talk. My goal state is pretty poorly defined by me. I don't yet have a good talk. And it's not clear in that state what I should be paying attention to, right? My goal state, right, and my initial state are very unclear to me. And it's also unclear what the operations are I'm supposed to perform. I'm supposed to say stuff, right, and maybe make gestures, but it's unclear what that is and what else I'm supposed to do along the way. And many real-world problems are ill-defined in this way. So following a conversation is an ill-defined problem. Like, what do you do? What are you supposed to say? When are you supposed to say it? How are you supposed to say it? To whom, right? One of my favorite ones, the one I often use, is going on a first date with somebody is a very ill-defined problem. And you know this because of the useless advice your friends give you, right? They say things like, show that you're interested, but not too much. Laugh, but not too often. Right, things like that. So everything is given and then taken away, and it's like, how can I fail to follow this advice, or how can I succeed? It's unclear. So many real-world problems are ill-defined like this, and what that means is what they're precisely lacking is a good enough problem formulation. The difficult issue with ill-defined problems is formulating them to a point where they're adequate enough so that you can apply your search heuristics and actually generate a problem solution. So I want to show you the power of this and the centrality of the problem of relevance in one of the standard examples used in psychology. And I made a promise to myself today that I would not do the 9-dot problem. So I'm not going to do the 9-dot problem. I'm going to talk about another one that is well researched in psychology. Some of you know this one. This is the mutilated chessboard. So here's the problem. We'll set it up. Right? So I have a standard chessboard, and I have 8 rows and 8 columns, so there's 64 squares. And the idea is I can cover because it's a square, I can cover 2 squares in either direction with a single domino. And then I ask you how many dominoes I need to cover the entire board, and you should say 32, because it's 64 divided by 2, of course. And then here's what I'm going to do next. I'm going to mutilate the chessboard. This is taken, by the way, from Kaplan and Simon's study of insight in 1990. I remove those 2 corners, which means I now have 62 squares. And can I cover the chessboard with 31 dominoes without overhang or overlap? And then you just tell your subjects, go, try and work it out. Now, what happens is many people, and we have the research on this, many people formulate this as a covering problem. They try to imagine the board, they try to imagine the dominoes, they try to imagine different configurations of dominoes. And if you formulate it that way, that becomes a very combinatorial explosive problem. Famously, one of the subjects in the experiment who had training in mathematics filled 10 Hilroy notebooks with mathematical calculations. But there's an alternative formulation of the problem. So it goes like this. When I put a domino on the board, no matter which way I orient it, it covers 1 black and 1 white square, correct? Which means if I'm going to cover the board with dominoes, I need an equal number of black and white squares. And then what you pay attention to is, what do you notice about those 2 squares that have been removed? They're the same color. So do I have an equal number of black and white squares left? So can I cover it with the dominoes? No. There you go. Okay? So you reformulate the problem, and it goes from being combinatorial explosive to very doable. And this is one of the meanings of insight within psychology, that kind of reformulating of a problem that makes it doable for you. Okay. So let me just stay there for a sec. What comes out of this is that what's central to problem solving is this ability we have to avoid combinatorial explosion. Let's talk about that. What that means is I don't search the whole space. Somehow I zero in on the relevant information. Not infallibly, because that would be some sort of algorithmic ability. But somehow we quite reliably zero in on relevant information. And it's kind of paradoxical when you think about it, because it means, to use a famous phrase, we somehow intelligently ignore a lot of information that's available to us. We don't even actually consider it and then reject it, because if we had to consider it and reject it, we would still be in combinatorial explosion. We somehow zero in. We somehow constrain that search space without searching through it in a way that facilitates us finding problem solutions. That has something to do with the problem formulation. So this ability to zero in on relevant information is crucial. But the problem is, right, because it is a fallible thing we do, we have to have this recursive ability. That's what's going on in insight. We have to be able to break out of a problem formulation when it's actually thwarting our attempts to solve our problems and generate an alternative problem formulation. So our relevance realization abilities have to be self-transcending and self-correcting on an ongoing basis, especially if many real-world problems are ill-defined problems. So the problem of relevance realization, and this, it feels almost paradoxical to talk about it, and it's sort of dynamically self-transcending and self-correcting, becomes a central issue when trying to understand how humans do problem solving. Okay, so another important cognitive ability we have is categorization. And why is categorization a problem? Categorization is a problem because it involves judgments of similarity. It involves judgments that these two things are similar enough to belong to a category. Now, at the level of sort of our folk psychology, there doesn't seem to be any problem about that. I just look out, oh, those two things are similar, those are not, and there we go. The problem is that obviousness is exactly what we need to explain. Goodman famously argued that any two objects, right, possess an indefinitely large number of shared characteristics. So, a plum and a lawnmower both contain, carbon, both weigh less than a ton, neither existed 300 million years ago, neither one is a particularly good weapon, neither one has ever appeared in a football game. Okay, so the list of things is huge, right? And your response to that, and when I do that, when I teach Introductory to Cognitive Science, and some of you have gone through this little drama, people say, well, yeah, that's all true, but those are kooky or irrelevant similarities. And that's the point. That's the problem. The problem is, of all the potential ones available to you, you somehow select only ones that are relevant. So the issue became in categorization, well, how do we try and come up with the principle by which relevance is determined in categorization? One of the first techniques was to try and say, well, we consider only sort of sets of necessary and sufficient conditions, but that doesn't really work because it requires that you should be able to give definitions for most of our concepts. And as Wittgenstein famously argued about things like games, we can't do that. Other attempts like prototypicality, frequency, invariance, simplicity, all run into trouble, and I can't do the full argument here. You can check out the paper, but they run into trouble because they try to pre-specify what's going to count as the relevant characteristics for comparison. But the point is, trying to do that bedevils us because we can make these shifts between things not being relevantly similar and then being relevantly similar to each other almost on the fly. So Barcelou gave the famous example, right, of, so you've got spouse, children, pets, works of art, explosive material, and toxic material. And people go, what? Wow, that's not a good category. And then I say, things you pay attention to when you're in a fire. Oh, right. And then that all fits, right? So the attempts to try and pre-specify this actually don't succeed. Now, there's some debate about this right now, sort of at the philosophical level within cognitive science. Some people are trying to argue that we can't really come up with a scientific theory of categorization or concepts as a result of this, but I'm not going to pursue that right now. All right. So what's going on in categorization was the same thing we saw going on in problem solving. Somehow we zero in on relevant information in a powerful way, and that it affords us to do one of our most fundamental abilities, which is to form categories. But of course, a lot of our cognition is not done by ourselves. It's done in connection with other people, in distributed cognition, either communication within an individual. For example, I made this, well, with Leo's help, I made this presentation last night, right, for John now, So it has to communicate from John then to John now. And of course, I also have to communicate with you guys. And so communication is one of the fundamental ways in which we try and improve our problem-solving abilities. We can bootstrap our own cognition, and we can, of course, link together and network brains and improve our problem-solving abilities. So conversation and communication are important to us. Now, the problem with that, for our purposes, is, of course, we cannot put everything we want to communicate into our utterance. This is, of course, how the field of pragmatics basically gets going. It has arguments about the irreducibility of pragmatics to semantics and syntactics. The idea is we can't say everything we want to say or what we want to communicate. So the slogan here is we have to convey much more than we can say. So if I drive up to you and make my window go down and say, I'm out of gas, you have to do a lot of work with that. You have to know that when I say I'm out of gas, I don't mean that I want to be flatulent, right? You have to understand that I'm referring somehow to something associated with me, probably my car, right, and not my shoes, right? And you have to understand that I'm referring to gasoline. You have to understand that I'm asking for directions. You see, I can go on and on and on. And if you try and put each one of those into an utterance, it gets its own penumbra of conveyance around it. So Grice famously tried to deal with that problem. And Grice specified that there are some basic principles governing how we try to communicate with each other. So these are the famous Gricean maxims: quantity, quality, manner, and relevance. I'm not going to have to make an argument for this one, of course. And I don't actually have to make an argument for the other three, because the argument's already in existence. This is the work of Sperber and Wilson, arguing that the other maxims collapse into the maxim of being relevant. So quantity is give the relevant amount of information. Manner is put your communication in the relevant format, use the relevant communication channel. Quality might strike you as a little more difficult, because quality is often understood as the maxim be truthful. Sperber and Wilson quickly point out that can't be our maxim, because very often people aren't uttering the truth. They only have to utter what they believe to be true. So the maxim becomes something more like be honest or be sincere. And then that becomes problematic, because what does that mean? Does that mean I have to somehow transmit everything in my mind to you? Well, that's basically an impossible task. So what I have to do is I have to try and get you to get some of the relevant implications of what I'm saying to, right? So that's what I'm trying to match. That some of what I consider important and relevant in my head will come to be in your head. And that, of course, is, again, a maxim of being relevant. What's important in here? What are the important implications and implicatures of in here? And I have to make sure that you pick those up. So all of the maxims collapse into the maxim to be relevant, right? And here again, we now find that relevance realization is central to the problem of communication. So we do a lot more of this in the paper, trying to show how many problems converge on the problem of relevance realization. So one of the things you might think about is, well, we have to sort of look at properties and processes within cognition and try and find the right place to try and talk about relevance. One might be at the level of representations, one might be more at the level of computation, and one is you might pursue a modularity strategy. You might think that there's sort of a special module or area in the brain dedicated to this central problem. The problem with trying to run relevance off of representation is an argument that goes back to Searle. I'm using it for purposes other than Searle, though. And this is the idea that representation presupposes aspectuality. When I represent something, of course, I don't represent all of its properties. That, again, would put me into a combinatorially explosive task. What I do is I represent some subset of properties that it possesses. I grasp an aspect of the thing. And Searle went on to argue that aspectuality presupposes consciousness. Many people have challenged that. I would argue that aspectuality, at least in turn, presupposes the ability to realize relevance, to zero in on the relevant set of features that are important or relevant to you. So the idea here is that you're not going to ultimately explain relevance realization, relevance with representations, because they actually presuppose the phenomena you're trying to explain. Computation. So computational, you might think that, well, I can somehow get it in terms of how information is encoded in propositions and inferentially manipulated, standard computational theory of mind. One of the most troubling things facing you is that many of the founding figures, Putnam and Fodor, for example, have argued that relevance is one of the things that computation doesn't seem to be capable of explaining. Fodor keeps making this argument, in fact. He made it in 99, he made it again in 2001, he made it again in 2006. And there's also a famous set of arguments by Wittgenstein, picked up especially by Brown in 1988, on why you're not going to be able to run it this way off of computation. So what's the Fodor idea? Well, the Fodor idea is that relevance is an issue of cognitive commitment. How much of your time and resources, and now we start to hear the economic language coming in. How much of your time and your resources you're going to commit to any particular aspect of your processing. Cherniak makes a very similar argument in his book on minimal rationality about how our judgments of feasibility affect what we consider relevant. If something is very difficult for us to process, it is hard for it to be relevant to us. And both of these, commitment and feasibility, right, are not properties of the proposition, because the proposition and all of its inferential relations can remain constant, while the cognitive commitment you give to it or the difficulty of processing the proposition can change, right? So if I'm really tired and irritable, I may not consider a certain proposition relevant that I will consider relevant when I'm not tired and irritable, right? Now, that brings in a very important problem. You can't really capture in the syntactic structures of the proposition or its inferential relations to other propositions these issues of cognitive commitment and feasibility. And that has been, there's been some very recent work on what psychologists are calling fluency that seems to be bearing this out in a really interesting way. So fluency is a term to describe that people seem to be using some judgment, probably affectively mediated, about the fluency of their processing. And I'm using the term twice because what it exactly is what we're going to discuss here in a minute, right? In order to evaluate the truth, the importance, the strength of the information they're processing. And one of the important ideas about fluency is it's content independent. It doesn't run off the content of what you're processing. It runs off the manner of how you're processing. So what's going on here is initially they thought fluency was measuring sort of the ease of processing and marking it with positive affect. But that can't be right for obvious reasons. If fluency is giving me these judgments on the basis of ease, and I'm processing in an easy manner that's generating all kinds of mistakes and preventing me from getting to my goal, then that's going to lead me very quickly astray. So people started to turn and talk about fluency more in terms of things like efficiency, how efficient your processing is. And the more efficient your processing is, the more your brain sort of says, this is good. Whatever's happening here is good. Pay attention to this. Make more of a cognitive commitment to this. And you see how feasibility and cognitive commitment are coming together in fluency. Now, in fact, efficiency isn't quite right because, for example, Topolitsky and Reber in 2010 argued that in insight, we're also seeing fluency effects. So Fluency is also measuring the way the system can redesign itself, adapt itself. And this lines up with the fact that we know that set shifting in the brain actually triggers significant dopamine release. So the idea here is fluency, flowing, is this dynamic relationship between efficiency and resiliency. And what's really interesting is that as that became clear, how psychologists started to describe fluency changed. So I'm going to give you a quote from a recent article by Hafner and Staple in 2010, trying to get clear what fluency is. And this is a quote: "Fluency triggers a feeling, quote, that enhances the appropriateness or relevance of applying stored knowledge to a stimulus." So basically, they understand fluency is some marker on relevance realization. And I want you to remember this idea is that in order to deal with commitment and feasibility, we had to invoke these notions of efficiency and resiliency. What about Wittgenstein? Wittgenstein said, well, one of the famous, and like I said, I'll come back to Brown in a sec. Wittgenstein said famously, one of the problems facing you is if you try and understand cognition in terms of rules, you quickly get an infinite regressive rules because every rule requires an interpretation, and the specification of that interpretation would itself require rules, and so on, and you get an infinite regressive rules. And therefore, it has to terminate in something other than rules. Brown makes a similar argument in his book on rationality in '88, but he argues that the way you end the regress is it actually terminates in something that is not rule governed, namely the skill of judgment, which of course is another way of talking about zeroing in on relevant information. And he went on to argue that that would probably be cashed out in terms of things like neural networks that operate differently from standard computational models. So the problem here is computation doesn't seem to be the right level at which we can try and find relevance. You might think, well, this is such a central problem. Maybe there's sort of a central area where relevance gets processed. Some people talk this way, not directly in this philosophical way we're doing here, but for example, some people talk about working memory this way. Lynn Hasher, in fact, does some really good work on sort of transforming our notion of working memory from a storage box to a relevance realization filter. That's the way she describes it. The problem with that is you don't want a relevance black box because that black box faces the very problem you're trying to solve with the black box. Namely, it's got all this information that is potentially available at all kinds of combinations of that information. And so the black box has to, possess the very intelligence you're trying to discharge into the functionality of the black box. And that, of course, is circular and not very helpful. All right. So the argument so far is computational, modular, and representational strategies for solving relevance fail. And therefore, we have some things we need. We need the account to be completely internal. Because if we're talking about external goals and relationships, we're going to be invoking representations, and we can't do that. So all goals and criteria must be internal to the brain and emerge developmentally from within it. This is necessarily a sub-semantic, sub-syntactic process. All right? It has to be scale invariant. It has to be acting simultaneously on all levels of cognition, local and invariant, because there can't be sort of any one place where this is being done. This has to be a constraint on all kinds of processing. And it has to be self-organizing, because it has to be self-transcending and self-correcting. And in connection with that, it can't rely on any intelligent design. We have to make sure that our account is non-homuncular in nature. So where should we look to find this? And what I want to argue is that something that satisfies all three of the stated criteria and what we argued in the paper, cognitive science and neuroscience are converging on, are what are called bioeconomical properties. And you heard me mention a couple of them already: efficiency and resiliency and fluency. So the idea here is, what are bioeconomical properties? They're not logical properties, they're logistical properties that operate ultimately on metabolic expenditure and optimization functions on reward, right? that are internal to the biology of the organism. So that's where you're going to look for this process. But you have to be careful how you look, because you might look in the wrong way. You might misformulate the looking problem, right? Because there's a very strong sense in which there can be no scientific theory of relevance. And if you try and come up, if you think what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up with some final theory, some that will provide me with a definition of relevance, and then what I'll do is I'll build a relevance detector in terms of that. You've misframed the problem, because there's some pretty deep reasons why there can't be a scientific theory of relevance. But that might sound like, oh my God, what's John going to do? Is he suddenly going to get us to chant or something? No, I'm going to argue that this isn't as weird or disturbing as you might think it is. First of all, why isn't it weird? Okay, scientific inductive generalizations require classes of things that are stable, homogeneous, and have intrinsic properties. So, right, if I want to, I can make classes all over the place. I can make a class of things that happen on Tuesdays. And the problem with that is that class isn't homogeneous. There's nothing that those events share typically other than them sort of happening on Tuesday, right? The class isn't stable. It's constantly changing, unlike, for example, the property of all gold things. So all gold things share some essential properties, right, in terms of which we can make the inductive generalizations. They're homogeneous, and those properties are stable. That's what affords the inductive generalizations. And we think also that the properties belong to gold, that gold has those properties regardless. Now, we don't think that Tuesdays are intrinsic to the world. I mean, it's kind of you have to do this sort of little thing in your mind to realize there aren't Tuesdays. I mean, we talk that way, but there's nothing we can sort of point to in the universe in any reliable way. Oh, there's Tuesdayness. Okay? Sorry for talking that way, but that's the point I'm trying to make. And of course, that's exactly the issue that's facing us with relevance. Hang on, let me go back here and just stay here for a sec. Because the things we find relevant, the class of things is not stable. It's constantly changing and shifting. The class of things we find relevant is not homogeneous. And it's pretty apparent, given some of our discussion, that relevance isn't an intrinsic property of objects or things. Things are just things. Now, that means we can't have a relevance detector. It means, in some sense, we are relevance projectors. But I don't just want to change metaphors, because that's not enough to do science. I want to try and build a much more careful alternative. I think rather than trying to get up a theory of what is relevant, what is relevance, we can actually build a theory of relevance realization. And I want to give you a really strong analogy. I'm going to push this analogy quite a distance, I guess is what I want to say. So consider the evolutionary concept of fitness. It's not intrinsic to the physics or the chemistry or the biology of the creature. It's not homogeneous. You can be, right, big or small, fast or slow, right? It's not stable. Of course, that's the whole point of evolutionary theory. It's constantly changing. And it's, of course, as I said, it's not intrinsic to the creature, because it's relational between the creature and the environment and other creatures in the environment. And that was one of the great sort of insights of Darwin, right? Stop trying to look for the final defining characteristics of fitness. Stop trying to look into the mind of God and figure out what the plan was. Stop trying to figure out what the purposes are in terms of which we could define fitness. Instead, don't do that at all. Try and come up with a mechanism by which fitness is constantly being redefined and redesigned by previous instances of fitness. That's what you do. Right? And one of the reasons why I think this is an apt analogy to begin with is we can think about relevance realization as exactly that, a kind of cognitive fitness, about how the brain can fit itself to the environment in an effective manner. Okay. Now, one of the problems that you might pose here, and it's one I often pose, is as soon as I start talking the way I just spoke, that its relevance realization is this self-organizing, evolving process like natural selection, evolution by natural selection. You may say, come on, everybody just, when they face a problem in cognitive science, they just take out this wand called self-organization and they go ding, and see, the problem goes away, right? And I don't want to ding this. I want to try and be a little bit more precise about it. So I want to start off with the no free lunch theorem, and the idea that no heuristic, right, can function sort of optimally across all the problems you're going to confront. And that's because, again, what we've discovered about relevance, you can't predefine it. There is no final definition. And that means what a heuristic has to do, right, is it has to pre-specify a certain class of characteristics as being inherently relevant. And what that means for you is that your heuristic is going to operate effectively where that matches what's relevant to the problem, and it's going to improve your performance in those areas. But where it mismatches, where what it tells you to consider relevant isn't relevant to you formulating and solving your problems, it's actually going to decrease your performance. In fact, a helpful way of thinking about what a bias is that a bias is just a misplaced heuristic. Okay. Now, let's take a look at that. So here's sort of what I mean by it, right? So the part on the left, right, is where the heuristic is helping you, and you pay a price for it, right, which is on the right. You're actually going to lose performance there. And the no free lunch theorem says basically all heuristics are going to have this kind of structure. Okay, so they have different domains of efficacy. But one of the things that Tim and Blake and I thought is that complementary heuristics can be deployed in competition with one another, resulting in a kind of opponent processing. So the idea is something like this. You set two heuristics off against each other in this manner, and then what you have is you have an opponent processing so that the system is constantly switching between them. And one of the things we noted is that, well, not just human biology, all biology, nature seems to have zeroed in on this solution for a lot of sort of fitting the organism to the environment problems. So a standard example, there's ones within vision between focal and peripheral vision, but one that you might all be familiar with, right, is one of the things I have to do as an organism is I have to constantly adjust my level of arousal. It's too high right now, and I'm trying to keep it down, but right? But I have to constantly, right? And the solution isn't to get always to, it's not a Canadian solution. We'll just sort of get immediate level of arousal at all times, right? That, oh, look, perhaps a tiger, right? That's not going to work for you, okay? So what we have is the autonomic nervous system is organized into two subsystems, the sympathetic system that tries to raise your level of arousal, and the parasympathetic that tries to reduce it, and they're locked into opponent processing. So one of the things the parasympathetic system does as it's activated is it tries to shut off, right, the sympathetic system and vice versa. And so what's happening is that right, the system is constantly, and it's not sort of it's not computing. This is one of Van Gelder's points, right? It's not doing computation. It's doing this opponent processing. So it's constantly, right, readjusting and redesigning arousal. That's just one example. There's many within your biology that evolution seems to have zeroed in on this way of dealing with the problem of heuristic processing. So what I want to argue is, right, that your brain is actually in a kind of opponent processing between two very central bioeconomic properties, efficiency and resiliency. So a lot of people have come into the idea of efficiency. It's in Sperber and Wilson's ideas about relevance, Montague's neuroscientific work. Friston has recently argued that all of neuroscience is sort of moving towards the idea of this as a scale-invariant constraint on how the brain operates. More and more, although, people are also talking about resiliency, because the thing about efficiency, right, is, maybe I'll use an economic analogy. It seems appropriate to the conference. I lived through the dark days of Ronald Reagan, and some of the older people in this room also did. And I guess the Americans are finally waking up into what that meant for them. But during that time, it was big to do downsizing, make your corporations as efficient as possible, cut out all the fat. And that, and that initially does increase your bottom line profit. The problem is those corporations become very brittle. They lack resiliency. They cannot take much damage. They have low fault tolerance. They don't have enough fat so that they can redesign themselves, right, to take advantage of unforeseen opportunities or to deal with how they might have to respond to how they've been hurt or damaged by the market. So the problem was that if you pursue efficiency sort of too imperialistically, it can actually cost you long term. And the brain is having to be plastic because the brain has to deal with the fact that it often has to repair itself, redesign itself in very significant ways. And of course, neuroplasticity has become a very important topic right now. So you want a lot of reserve, right? So you can repair and rewire. You want some pre-adaptive precursors to new design. You want redundancy, some redundancy, so you can deal with signal loss. So there's all kinds of things you want to do to keep resiliency in your system too. And the thing is, these aren't a trade-off relationship. You sort of get one at the expense of the other. And so the idea is, because they're in this trade-off relationship, you can set them into opponent processing. They can be set to be complementary to each other. And then what you can do is have that complementary opponent processing operate as your optimization on reward. So what it's constantly doing, just like arousal was sort of constantly setting me, this constant to and fro between efficiency and resiliency is helping set, right, itself to, oh, this is reward's getting better more reliably across time. I'm optimizing for reward. So what we try to argue is you can have the brain running a lot of internal economic properties, right? And if they're running them, they will actually translate, they will cause the brain to make the organism operate in a way, right, so that it has interactional properties with the environment. But it's not that the brain has set these as a goal for itself. This emerges in the interaction from the environment, from the brain doing all of this internal processing. So you remain sub-semantic, sub-syntactic. So one of the things we talked about was cognitive scope. Basically what you want to do there is you want to, I won't go into the details here, it has to do with sort of weight decay functions within a neural network. But what you can do is you can do information compression versus information particularization. So compression is like you make the information more implicit, and then particularization is you allow your function to fit more tightly to your data set. So compression gives you lots of transfer because it tends to pick up on what's invariant, and particularization gives you context sensitivity because it overfits your function to your data set. So to give you a loose analogy, compression is like finding the line of best fit, and particularization would be like finding a very complex function for your data set, overfitting. Now, the thing is, if you run those within the system, it will actually have this function. It will constantly adjust and redesign the applicability of your information. Think about it. So you want to fit yourself to the environment. Well, there's two kinds of machines you can be. Right? You can be a general purpose machine that transfers across a lot of environments, or you can be a special function machine. So one of my standard examples is, this is a really good general purpose thing. I like having it. But it's, I also, since I moved to my new house in Whitby, Kelly has sort of, been working on me to become more of a handyman, which I think that's not wired into my DNA, but I'm trying really hard. And you really learn the value of specialized tools because when you got a screw, only a screwdriver, right? Everything else is right bad, right? And often the only way to affix two things together in the way you need it affixed is with a screw, right? So screwdriver, hammer, right? You want those. Does that mean I have 3 minutes left? Okay. Okay, so I'll go a little bit into my question. Okay, so, but the thing is, you wouldn't like it if I sort of did this to you. I'm going to strand you on a desert island, and I'll chop your hands off and attach a hammer here and a screwdriver here. You want, right? Because for some tasks, you want this, And for some tasks, you want the special purpose machine. But you don't want to overcommit to either one. You want a brain that is constantly trading between them. And that's what cognitive scope will do. I can't get into it now because I'm obviously running out of time. But you can play temporal displacement learning off against inhibition on return within your neural network. And that will actually get your brain constantly trading between exploiting and exploring its environment. You can do cognitive prioritization. You play various cost functions off against each other. The idea is we don't have a single channel by which we obtain reward, and we have to have flexible gambling. Sometimes we want to make the big bet, and sometimes we want to make lots of little bets, right? And so you're going to be constantly playing between them. So here's the idea, right? Compression versus particularization. We argue that it maps really well onto sort of old Piagetian ideas about assimilation versus accommodation and Piaget's sort of dynamical model of development. But that ultimately cashes out in terms of information integration versus information differentiation. So here's the argument I want to make about that. These are all the things that relevance realization do for you, right? Now, the work I did with Leo, who does psychometric testing, is that basically these are all the things we test in relevance for general intelligence. It's the same set. What we're testing for in general intelligence is we're basically testing for abilities of relevance realization. Now, if that's right, and if relevance realization is about sort of integration and differentiation, compression and particularization, we should be able to do the following. If general intelligence is relevance realization, and relevance realization is this sort of internal set of constraints operating under efficiency and resiliency between compression and particularization, we should be able to see something in the brain that's doing that that is highly correlated with general intelligence. And so there is such a thing. It's self-organizing criticality in the brain. So neurons fire in sync, and that's been tracked to information integration, compression, and then they go asynchronous, the neural avalanche, that allows differentiation, and then there's a new synchronization, and so on, and the brain's constantly doing this. And what that means is if self-organizing criticality is running some of the machinery of relevance realization, and relevance realization is general intelligence, we should find that variations in self-organizing criticality are predictively related to variances in measures of general intelligence, and that was actually found by Thatcher et al. When they did work on phase reset. So differences in self-organizing criticality in the brain map very tightly onto differences in general intelligence. It's really supporting this argument. Now, when we started making this argument, we picked up on the Hebbian principle that firing should always affect wiring, and wiring should always affect firing. So we should also see the brain wiring in a way that trades between efficiency and resiliency. And we can see that. Oh, by the way, I should mention, self-organizing criticality is scale invariant in the brain, just the way we need relevance realization to be. Okay, so this is the way your brain can wire up. There's three types of networks. It can be a regular network, lots of local connections, right? It can be a chaotic network with a wide variety of connections. The number of connections is constant here, by the way. Or this can be a small world network. I apologize for the name. It comes from the Disney song, Small World After All. Okay? Now you can measure the efficiency of these things in terms of like mean path distance. You take all the possible pathways, any 2 points, and you average the distances. And so the higher the mean path distance, the more inefficient your network is. Now, it might strike you as counterintuitive, but this is the least efficient network. Okay? And this is also counterintuitive. This is the most efficient network. Okay? But what does this network give you? This network is highly resilient. It can maintain its function under a lot of different circumstances, damage. This network is not resilient. Some damage can sort of cause the whole network to stop functioning in a proper way. So what you want is you want a network that trades between, that gets us sort of the best of both worlds. Sorry for the pun. Right? And that's what this is. This is a small world network. It's mostly regular, giving you a lot of resiliency, but it's got some chaotic long distance functions, random, and that really increases the efficiency, not quite to here, right? So if a brain is also wiring to trade between efficiency and resiliency, you should see a brain wiring this way. And what we now know is that in a scale invariant way, the brain is wiring this way. There's a small world network. Now that, when Leo and Zach and I started making this argument 2 or 3 years ago, we made the prediction that, right, differences in this kind of wiring should be correlated to general intelligence. So the more a brain is like this, the more generally intelligent it is. And that has just been shown by work by Langer et al. 2012, that variations in this track variations in measures of general intelligence very tightly. And of course, the idea is self-organizing criticality, the firing, and small world network, the wiring, mutually afford each other. So here's what we got. We need a theory of relevance realization. Bioeconomic properties appear to satisfy key path constraints in coming up with such a theory. Relevance realization appears to be a good account of general intelligence. Neurodynamic, and in fact neuroconnectivity evidence seems to support this bioeconomic account. And so in short, it is internal economics that makes us externally smart. Thank you very much.